Hello everyone! I got some good news and some bad news. I still haven't been able to go to Denmark because the border is still closed. But I still got some treats for you guys, so why don't you tag along? Because in order for us to truly understand Kierkegaard, we actually have to go 2,800 kilometers south and all the way back to 5th century BC. Yes, today we're going to talk about Socrates. So today I'm not going to speak so much about Kierkegaard's life. I want to save that until I get to Denmark. So we're going to focus on Socrates today. Okay, so the book that I'm going to talk about is mostly this one. It is actually Søren Kierkegaard's dissertation. It was first published in 1841, and it's called The Concept of Irony, with a continual reference to Socrates. And this is his first major work, and that's why I'm beginning with this one. And also, since I can't go to Denmark, it's a proper place to start. So we'll talk more about Socrates today.
Socrates is a very important figure. He is seen as the founder of Western philosophy. He was born probably around 470 BC. We can't know this thing for sure. His father was a sculptor and his mother a midwife. When he was a young man, he participated in the Peloponnesian War as a hoplite against Sparta. According to different sources, he was an exceptionally good soldier. Socrates later had 3 children together with his wife Xanthippe. In his later years he spent much time lecturing people around Athens, which greatly disturbed the people in power. For instance, Socrates argued against democracy. He was later put to trial, where he was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. The charges reading: Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and of introducing other new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded his death.
One cool fact about this book is that during the 19th century, everyone who was admitting their master's degree was supposed to write their essay in Latin. But Kierkegaard didn't want to do that. He thought that his essay would suffer if it was written in Latin. So he actually sent a letter to the King of Denmark enabling him to write it in his mother tongue, Danish. So here he says, "To the King, the undersigned ventures to appear before your Majesty with the humble petition for permission to present his essay prepared for the master's degree on the concept of irony, with a constant reference to Socrates in the mother tongue. Yet so that Latin theses be appended to the same, and the oral defense be conducted in Latin." The 2nd June of 1841, Copenhagen. Søren Orby Kierkegaard, candidate in theology with laudabilis from June 1840. Respectfully seeks his permission to present his essay prepared for the master's degree on the concept of irony, with the constant reference to Socrates in the mother tongue. Yet so that there be appended to the same Latin theses, and that the oral defense be conducted in Latin. So we have one major issue when it comes to Socrates. He didn't write anything at all. So we only today have the accounts from 3 major sources: Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. Søren actually talks about, in his essay, the true conception of Socrates, since we have 3 different accounts of him. But I won't go through so much about that because I don't want to bore you guys to death. But we'll mostly talk about Plato's conception.
In Plato's dialogues, we very often find Socrates walking around Athens and just stumbling upon a person where he engages in conversation. They start discussing a particular subject where the other person claims to be an expert on. Socrates starts asking questions about the topic, trying to help the person coming closer and closer to some sort of truth on the subject. This process is also called the Socratic dialectic.
A couple of years ago, when I read Plato for the first time, I actually was kind of mad because I think it was the dialogue Euthyphron, because it was only a couple of pages long, but I remember that it ended without a result. I thought I spent like 1 hour reading and not getting anything out of it, because the dialogue starts with Euthyphron speaking with Socrates about piety. Euthyphron have a couple of definitions of piety, but Socrates starts questioning about his definitions. And they both together they find out that his definitions weren't correct. So Socrates continues to question Euthyphron about what piety is. And in the end, they end up with the definition that they actually started out with. And Socrates points out, we ended up in a circular argument, so we have to begin again. But at that point, Euthyphron is tired of Socrates, and he wanders off. And that is the end of the dialogue. So we end up without a result. So in another of Plato's dialogues, Menon tells Socrates that he resembles an electric ray that numbs people whenever he touches anyone. He numbs their knowledge. Socrates replies here, if the electric ray itself is numb in a way that makes other people numb, then I resemble one, but not else. For it is not so that I myself have answers that makes people unable to respond. This is very important, this last sentence, because he claims that he doesn't have any answers himself. He just questions everyone about the topics that they're talking about, not giving them any answers, just questioning about their conception of the word that they're talking about.
In the same dialogue, Socrates is helping a slave to discover geometrical facts, simply by asking him questions about figures he draws in the sand. Still, he claims not to give him knowledge about the figures, but simply helping him realize the truths himself. Socrates saw himself just like his mother, a midwife, helping people make birth to facts that they already possess. Here, Kierkegaard says, with the youth now feeling indissolubly bound to him, there supervened that the condition which Alcibiades so aptly described as Socrates' transition from the lover to the beloved. If one will conceive his relation to the youth in this way, then one is forcefully reminded of the art of midwifery which he claimed to possess. He assisted the individual to intellectual delivery, severed the umbilical cord of substantiality. The counterpart to Socrates were the so-called Sophists. They were experts on rhetoric and masters of conveying people. The Sophists earned money on teaching truths to their students. Truths which Socrates sought to expose as lies and deceits. The way Kierkegaard sees it, the Sophists taught people knowledge, so they can be seen in a positive manner. They sell knowledge. And Socrates being the opposite of that, where he merely exposes people's lack of knowledge, so Socrates can be seen in a negative manner. And also, since Socrates thought he never taught anything, he refused to get paid.
So Socrates realized that a lot of people in Athens was walking around believing that they knew a bunch of things. So he saw it as his task to show them where they are wrong. Here he says in Plato's Apology, "The god has created the city as though it were a big and noble horse. And because of its size, it moves very slow, so it needs a stinging gadfly to wake him up."
There is a story about a man traveling to the Oracle of Delphi, asking the oracle if Socrates is the wisest man in all of Greece. The oracle replies, yes. And in a truly Socratic manner, Socrates disputes whether this is correct. So he traveled around Greece trying to find a man who's wiser than him. After some time, he concludes that the oracle is correct, but only because all the other men he's spoken with have claimed that they had some kind of knowledge, and that Socrates claimed he knew nothing.
One curious thing about Socrates is that he claimed to have a daemon. It is very hard to understand really what this daemon was or is, but it was claimed to be a voice inside his head that told him not to do things. Here Kierkegaard says, and I quote, "On the other hand, what I must ask the reader to notice is quite significant for the entire conception of Socrates, namely, that the daemonic is represented only as a warning and not as commanding. That is, as negative, not as positive." So as you can see, we're still sticking to this conception that Socrates is being seen through purely negative, not as positive. That is very important for Kierkegaard. Another philosopher that Kierkegaard both loved and hated is Hegel. And here Kierkegaard quotes Hegel in his essay. And I quote, "In the divine sign of Socrates, we see the will which formerly had simply transferred itself beyond itself, now beginning to apply itself to itself, and so to recognize its own inward nature. This is the beginning of self-knowing and so of authentic freedom." This is actually very interesting. So what Hegel is saying here, he's saying this is the beginning of self-knowing and so of authentic freedom. So they're actually suggesting that Socrates is the first real individual, and that he is the first person to be authentically free from the government of Athens.
So could Socrates actually be the very first individual? Here is a quote from Hegel's Geschichte der Philosophie. "The subject is the determining and deciding principle. Whether the mind deciding is good or bad is now determined by the subject. That is to say, the subject stands freely above that which must be regarded as determining him. He stands freely above it not merely at an instant of choice, but at every moment, for the arbitrary will constitutes no law, no consistency, no content. The point of Socrates deciding within oneself began to unfold with Socrates. For the Greeks, this was an unconscious determination. With Socrates, the deciding mind is placed in the subjective consciousness of man, and the important question is, how does this subjectivity appear in Socrates himself? Because the person, the individual, makes the decision. We come back to Socrates as a person, and what follows is a discussion of his personal relations. And Kierkegaard continues, now the form in which subjectivity appears in Socrates is the daimonic. But as Hegel correctly enjoins that the daimonic is not yet conscious, it is apparent that the Socratic subjectivity vacillates between finite and infinite subjectivity. For in consciousness, the finite subject renders himself infinite. So as you notice, the minute we get to the original text from Hegel and Kierkegaard, the language gets way more complicated. But think of it like this. In the normal, usual way, you have a billiard ball, number 6, and here comes number 5 hitting it. Number 5 is causing number 6 to move. So to say, number 6 is determined by the other ball, and the other ball is exterior to itself. So the movement is coming from the outside. But then you have Socrates, claiming he has a daemon, a voice inside of him. So the daemon is interior to him. It's part of himself. So in this instance, here, Socrates is determining himself by himself. So in this sense, Socrates is free.
This quote right here pretty much sums up the whole essay. The difficulty here encountered is essentially that irony, in a strict sense, can never be set forth as a thesis. Because irony is a determination of the being for himself subject, who, with perpetual agility, allows nothing to endure, and because of his agility is unable to consolidate himself in the total view that he causes nothingness to exist.
So whenever Socrates used his dialectic to question people about their knowledge, he's really trying to make them realize they too know nothing. So he is causing nothingness to exist inside of them.
Here's an interesting thing for all you Hegelians out there. In the Hegelian dialectic, you have the thesis, and then you have the negation of that, which is the antithesis. And with the antithesis, after that comes a movement forward that becomes a synthesis. So the negation in the Hegelian sense is actually a movement forward. But in the Socratic ironic sense, a negation is always nothingness. So this point is actually very, very important for Kierkegaard.
Here is a quote from Kierkegaard's book, Philosophical Crumbs. The word contradiction is here not to be given the same volatile meaning that Hegel have made himself and others believe, namely that the contradiction has the power to bring forth anything.
So Kierkegaard actually saw his life as a Socratic task. He thought of the University of Copenhagen being Sophists, proclaiming truths about theology and mainly Christianity. So he saw it as his purpose to show them where they are wrong. So this is why this book is so important for us to really understand Kierkegaard. Because almost all of his books are written under pseudonyms. Because in all these books you won't even find his name mentioned. This was a really way for Kierkegaard to distance himself from the ideas. That way we will actually focus on the ideas rather than the man Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard is in a way irrelevant. He wants us to focus on the ideas.
For instance, in the book Either Or, a book that I will talk in great lengths in the upcoming episodes, it is written under the pseudonym Victor Eremita. It begins with Victor buying an escritoire from an antique shop. In it, he finds a secret compartment where he finds a box full of manuscripts. The manuscripts is actually the book itself, so Victor is just the publisher of these manuscripts. So the first part is written by a man called Mr. A, and the second part is actually letters addressed to Mr. A by a man called Wilhelm. And the last part is a letter addressed to Wilhelm, who later forwards it to Mr. A, and Kierkegaard's name is not even mentioned anywhere in the book. The irony starts to show, doesn't it? So why is Socrates so relevant when we're interpreting Kierkegaard? In Lee M. Capel's introduction to the concept of irony, he says, "He was a writer with a natural predilection for such ingredients as ambiguity, irony, humor, satire, and polemic, so much so that this same tendency was formalized through the usage of pseudonyms, masks, concealment, and postures into a theory of indirect communication, which, together with his edifying or direct communications, culminated in the developing construct that he called his authorship. There is, therefore, an initial continuity, at the very least of techniques, between the academic essay on irony and the pseudonymous works. That there is also a continuity of ideas was articulated by George Brands, with whom the serious study of Kierkegaard began in 1877, when he called the attention to the importance of the essay on irony by maintaining that it was the true point of departure for Kierkegaard's authorship.
So the purpose of this episode is that you really need to understand that whenever we talk about any of Kierkegaard's books, we have to put on these ironic glasses which enables us to not take these ideas 100% seriously like Kierkegaard thought of it himself. And we're back, just where we started, just like a circular argument. Isn't that ironic? Well, truly, thank you so much for watching. It's been an honor. Also, if I won't be putting out the next episode until I'm able to go to Denmark, so it might be a while. I hope it'll be soon though. And also, if you want to, the next book that I'm going to go through is Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety. So if you want to read it beforehand, be my guest. Big thanks. Don't forget subscribing if you want to. And also, you can support me on Patreon. It would help a lot. Stay safe, everyone. Take care.